Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining us from. And thank you so much for joining us for this session on finding a product prioritization framework that works, presented by Product Management Today and sponsored by Logi Analytics. I'm Brittany, the site manager of Product Management Today, and I'm really excited to be bringing you this session with hard-earned insight on how to decipher which prioritization method is right for you. I've been really looking forward to talking with our guest, Janna Bastow, today. These are always really interesting and amusing conversations, and I know that she has a plethora of fantastic insights to share with us. And don't worry if you have to leave today's session early. We will be recording the webinar and sending it along with the slide deck to all of our registrants within 48 hours. Before we go any further, I want to thank Logi Analytics for sponsoring this webinar and helping us to make this happen. If you haven't heard of Logi, they're an embedded analytics solution that helps product teams to create, deploy, and constantly improve analytic applications that engage users and drive revenue. Logi Analytics allows you to focus on building the best applications for your users while keeping you competitive. So thanks again, Logi. On that note, please feel free to ask questions during today's session. You can do so by submitting them into the questions panel on the right side of your screen. We'll be answering them throughout and at the end of the presentation, so please write in any questions that pop into your mind while Janna is presenting. My lovely colleague Erin will be fielding your questions today. She'll be happy to answer any questions you might have, so pull up the panel right now and say hello to let her know that you're listening to us. And lastly, if you have any audio issues during today's presentation, you may wish to dial in by phone. You can do so by selecting the More button in the upper right portion of your screen, and then select the Switch to Phone option. So today, I'm very lucky to be joined by Janna Bastow, who boasts over a decade of experience as a product manager. Janna is the CEO and co-founder of ProdPad, a product management and road mapping software for product people, as well as the co-founder of Product Tank and Mind the Product, which is an international product management community and series of events for fellow product people. She often starts and stops our conversations with the question, what problem are you trying to solve? So without any further ado, please take it away, Janna.
Thanks so much for having me. All right, so today we're going to be talking about finding a product prioritization framework that works. Now, why are we actually talking about this? Now, to me, prioritization at the end of the day is really core to our jobs as product people. It's the product person's job to define what's being done next and to rally the team behind those priorities. And it's a hard job. It's fraught with contention at every corner, as prioritization at its core is about sorting out all those competing demands. And it's a frustrating job. And it's one that you'll never feel like you really have right. And so it's only natural that we look for ways to make this job easier. And so if only there were a way to simplify it, to take the pressure off having to say no to 10 things in order to say yes to the right things that need to go first. And so prioritization frameworks seem to actually offer this. But are they offering too much of a holy grail? So Brittany did a great introduction, so I'll keep this short and sweet. You already know me, I'm Janna Bastow. Feel free to reach out to me and come meet me in your city if I happen to be there. I'm happy to go do coffee or drinks or anything like that. You might know me from my work with ProdPad. It's a B2B SaaS company that I co-founded. It's a tool that thousands of companies use around the world to manage their products. It allows teams to gather insights and suggestions and feedback, and very key, it allows them to prioritize those product changes on a roadmap. So this gives me some really interesting insight into what people are using to prioritize and what kind of questions they ask when they're running into prioritization problems. And as you also now know, I'm also one of the founders of Mind the Product, which is a big community of product people. So between these two things, I've had the chance to see how thousands of product people work and talk about the prioritization. And I'm here to let you in on one secret, which is that there are no silver bullets. There's no one framework to rule them all. It's not to say that there's nothing, that there's not a lot that we can't learn from the art of prioritization, which is why we're all here today. But there is no one silver bullet or one framework that's going to solve all of our problems. Let's take this back and look at where prioritization really came from. Let's start at the very beginning. I don't know how many people actually know this. I remember being really shocked when I learned this one. Did you know that the term priority didn't, up until about the mid-40s, actually have a plural form? I mean, there's no such thing as having multiple priorities, or the redundant top priority, as we call it. The word was simply priority. There was no such thing as the word priorities. The word priority itself stems from the word or stems from the same root as the word prior, meaning first. And so it wasn't until the mid-40s that we started using the word priorities. You can actually see it. So this is a graph of Google's Ngram search. It looks at the use of words in books over time, or words in print over time, and it shows the usage of terms priority and priorities. And something happened in the 40s and 50s that just shows this phenomenon of prioritization. And it's really only a recent thing that we started to agonize over this prioritization malarkey that we're stuck in. So what is a framework for? At its best, a framework is a way to frame or shape your thinking, to give you a common lens or angle on something so you can introduce some element of consistency in your work. They're meant to augment our ability to think, but not replace it. But at their worst, they can be tedious and over-relied upon. A good product manager should have a wide range of frameworks in their back pocket and experience enough to know when to use them and when to let go. So I'm going to go through some of the most common ones I've seen in my career and in my research and help you all navigate the attraction and the pitfalls of each. But before we get started, let's do a poll to see which ones you might be using. Brittany, can you pull up that poll that we opened up earlier?
Yes.
So you should now see a poll kicking off in your webinar widget.
Yep, so now it's up on the full screen. So you can select more than one option. So if you use multiple of these frameworks, definitely choose 2 or 3 of them. And if you don't use any of these, or if there's a different framework that you use, please write that into the questions panel so we can get a sense of what everybody uses. And it looks like almost everyone has voted. So we're gonna let this run for a few more seconds. If you haven't voted yet, that's fine. Just let us know what you use. All right, and I'm gonna close the poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, so
All right.
the results, we have 14% of the audience saying they use the Moscow framework, 10% saying they use RACE, 49% saying impact versus effort, 55% saying weighted scoring, and then 32% saying story mapping.
Okay, cool. And so what I'm actually seeing there is a bunch of overlaps as well. So those percentages added up to way more than 100%, which means that people are using more than one as well. So let's dive into some of the research that I found as well. One of the most common frameworks that I see people use is none at all. So some of us out there are actually prioritizing with nothing more than our instincts. And there's actually nothing wrong with this. You actually might find that none of the usual frameworks are actually doing it for you. And so you've always just sort of prioritized by asking around and figuring out what you and the team thinks is next most important. This is done by a series of conversations and various touch points you have with customers and your team, and asking different sorts of questions, and then coming up with a priority. It doesn't mean that you haven't been doing product management. Oftentimes it means that you've been even more mindful, sometimes doing great prioritization work. And you'll actually probably recognize some of the techniques in the upcoming other common frameworks as things that you think about when you're prioritizing without a framework, or what you consider without a framework. So it's actually a good sign that you're asking the right sorts of questions. So don't be afraid if you're not using one of these frameworks that we're going to be talking about. Using none or none of the above is a totally legit answer as well. I still come across people who are using this Moscow one. I don't mean the Russian city. I mean must have, should have, will not have, or won't have, and could have method of prioritizing. More and more, I'm finding that this one isn't really fit for purpose. It seems to be more of an outdated project-focused one. Moscow sort of came out of a waterfall style of prioritizing, and it's sort of set with the idea that you've got this fixed scope and you're working out which features need to go into a set project for that one particular client that you're building for, that one particular project that you're putting in. And so it doesn't really give clarity on what to do when faced with a long-term product strategy. So this one I'm finding seems to be getting less and less popular. But when I started in product management 15 years ago, this one was certainly one of the most popular ones. So we're actually starting to see this one change in terms of popularity, but it's still, as we just saw, I think it was about 14% of people said that they were using this one, and so still is gaining popularity. Or still is popular enough to gain mention. One of the problems that I find with it is when you have it with something that says, will not have, whatever happens to those things, do they get deleted from the backlog? Does that mean will not ever have? It doesn't really give clarity on that sort of longer term product strategy that you're looking for. Impact versus effort was another one that came up. This was quite a popular one, it sounded like. I think, Brittany, was that about 50% that I heard?
Yep, it was 49%, yeah.
49%, okay. So yeah, about a 50-50 on this one. So this one is popular because it's a lightweight way of gathering insights to help with priority scoring. And the whole idea is that each idea is given an impact and effort. Now, the key here is that it's not meant to be a measure of dollars or days. I like to think of this as like the gut feel meter. Like as a product manager, you have this instant gut feel. Somebody comes to you and says, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had this one feature or this one thing? And instantly your gut says, ooh, that sounds really tough. Or, oh, actually, that sounds like it could be really interesting to us. You're not meant to instantly know how many developer days it's going to take or how many dollars it's going to net you at the end of 6 months or something like that, but you do have a general idea of what it might come out to, and so the general estimation often comes out based on sort of more of a guesstimation. So you see the impact and effort scores here are it's a 0 to 100 scale, but the numbers as they get larger get further apart. If you're familiar with planning poker, this is actually using a similar or a same scale as that. It's a Fibonacci scale that's based on the sort of ratio of Fibonacci. And the whole idea is that what it's representing is that the larger something is, the more guesstimation has to go into it, and helps keep you away from trying to overestimate or get too detailed in your estimations too soon, and more just to sort of take the pressure off and going like, ooh, okay, that's definitely something big, so that goes here, and that's something small, so we can actually break that down into a little more detail. We can understand that, and now that we've done that, we have just enough data to start measuring it. And so the key here is that it's not turned into any sort of fancy calculation. These are just estimations, but you can start visualizing it. You can start seeing where these things sit relative to each other. So they're visualized into this 2x2 prioritization chart with other factors visible. Like in this example, the color is indicating as to whether the ideas are new or old or fresh or stale. And the size is indicating as to whether they're little tiny one-liners with no detail at all, or whether they're big dots with lots and lots of details and specs and customer backup and feedback and research and other stuff backing up why it deserves to exist. So you can sort of visualize your backlog all in one space using this sort of method. And the assumption is that more detailed estimates is going to happen later down the line, which is always true. Your first estimations are always going to be rough. But and the other key thing is that when you're estimating effort in this way, assume that it is an estimation, but also look at the entire effort, not just the effort of the developers. I think a lot of teams sort of get stuck in that whole thing of thinking about how much effort it's going to take the developers to build something. It might take no effort at all to add a button to something, but it might take a lot of effort to actually get it launched or legalized or get it past marketing or, to support and maintain it, whatever that button is meant to actually represent. So think about what that entire effort's meant to be and estimate that on sort of a grander scale, and then map that out to give you sort of this rough prioritization that you can visualize. So that's more or less how impact and effort is meant to work. Now, weighted scoring was another one that came out as relatively popular as well. I think this one was more than 50% as well. Is that right, Brittany?
Yes, sorry, 55% said weighted scoring, so the highest amount of people in the audience.
Okay, yeah, this one is popular. And I can see why, because it's sort of like the most complete, right? It just answers all of your questions, and at the end of the day, it just tells you the answer. And there's a lot to love about this, but I've actually never found one that works. In all my life and all my conversations and all my interactions with product people. And it took me a long time to figure out what was going on here. But here's what I think is actually happening. So you have these criteria, and you can have any number of criteria, right? In this case, it's not that much different than impact and effort, except that you've gone much more granular. You might have revenue and risk and alignment and market and technical feasibility and any number of different criteria that you set out here. You have a weight, which is an estimation of how important it is relative to the other criteria to your company. And so that's sort of an estimation of how important each of these things is. And then you take each of the features that you want to build and you score it based on how well they score, usually out of 100 on each of these particular factors. And each of these scores in yellow is an estimation, right? You're making a few assumptions here and there. And then what you do is you take the numbers in yellow, you multiply them by the numbers in green, and you get the numbers at the bottom in blue. And what this weighted scoring thing is essentially telling me is that feature 3 is the best feature to build. It's got a score of 64, so I should work on that first, then feature 2 at 55, and then feature 1. And it's sort of like, job done. No product managers needed here. Go work on those ones and come back when we're done those 3 features. But it often ends up sending people down the wrong path because you'll often end up with product managers or product teams, because the whole team is complicit in this one, where either they'll do this weighted scoring and it'll tell them a result that isn't actually working for them. For some reason, they come up with a bunch of numbers and it says, go do this one first. And they look at that list and they go, well, yeah, but we have to go do this one next because, we've got this deadline coming up, or because this customer says so and we've committed to something, or because, we've got this, this new opportunity that's just appeared on the horizon, or whatever else. There's always something that might come up that isn't accounted for in this data. And so they'll end up either ignoring this weighted scoring system that they've created, ignoring the algorithm, or they'll end up actually just following this algorithm, following the scoring system that they've created, and possibly building the wrong thing and not following their gut. And both things are sort of counterproductive, because if you're ignoring the algorithm that you've created, then what's the point of the algorithm? If you are ignoring if you're ending up building the system itself, then what's the point of having people and having that adaptability and that ability to stop and say, hey, shouldn't we sense check this? Shouldn't we check that it is in fact the right thing? And I think the fundamental reason why these numbers end up so shaky at the end of the day is because the numbers in green are assumptions and the numbers in yellow are assumptions. And frankly speaking, the numbers in pink are assumptions. This is your company's assumptions and what it thinks are most important to it. So all of these are a bunch of assumptions and you're multiplying them together. And if you multiply 2 numbers together, you're basically just sort of multiplying your assumptions. And so the end result is sort of exasperating your assumptions as opposed to minimizing those assumptions. And so by the time you're done, you've ended up with a bunch of numbers that may or may not actually have any real bearing on what actually deserves to be done next. And so oftentimes this gets a little bit lost along the way. So weighted scoring is one way of looking at stuff, but it's one of those things where I've actually yet to see a complete weighted scoring system that actually can take in all the information and not actually run into the problem where it either becomes too tedious to use or ends up not getting ignored because it's not missing particular pieces of information. Which takes me to another one, which is really quite popular, particularly recently. This one has really, really gained in the ranks, which is the RICE one. This one, I believe, was devised by Intercom. It was certainly popularized by them.
Actually, Janna, before we dive into RICE, we have a question on weighted scoring.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So one of the audience members asked if you could clarify a little bit further on how people calculate these weighted scores for each feature.
Yeah, so usually what you'd have is a little bit of some sort of algorithm happening behind. I hope you can see my cursor here where I'm pointing around. So here I am pointing out that you've got feature 1, you're saying that it's strategic alignment, you're saying it's 40 out of 100. So you made some assumption, it's 40 out of 100 versus feature 2, which has more strategic alignment, so it's a 70 out of 100. And feature 3 is 45, so it's slightly better strategic alignment than feature 1. And even right there, you've got these two numbers that are similar but different. And strategic alignment is worth 50% of the weight. So that's what you're saying there. Market attractiveness, you're now looking at this and saying, okay, well, this one is super attractive to the market. This one is definitely not attractive to the market. It's only 30 out of 100. This one's somewhere in the middle, right? So you've given these ones some scores that you've created. And again, you've created scores based on technical feasibility. Technical feasibility is only worth 20% of your score for whatever reason. And you've taken these numbers and you've basically said, this times this times this times this, right? So you're basically calculating these out using a weighted scoring algorithm, which is basically just multiplying each of these numbers by the weight that is given. Take those weighted numbers, each of these, add them up, and you'll end up with this particular score. So 40 times 50 plus 30 times 30 plus 50 times 20 should give you 39. 70 times 50, 40 times 30, that sort of thing. And you'll come up with these numbers at the end of it. And from there, you're able to come up with these particular numbers. And the problem is that each of these numbers that we've come up with has been made up by someone along the line, right? These aren't hard, fast data points. These are estimations that somebody on your team has made. And, you know, as to how this one got a 45 and this one got a 40, well, you know, it's hard to say. As to how this ended up with 20% and this got 30%, again, a bit of an estimation. So as to why this one came out at 64 and this one 55, you could tweak this number or this number or this number or any of these numbers, and these numbers would change quite vastly. And then at the end of the day, you're saying, well, why did we say this one was first? Well, because the computer said so, right? The numbers calculated out as so. But in reality, just by changing how you're calculating it, you could actually change that quite vastly.
Perfect, thank you. I think that answered the question. Actually, yeah, they just wrote in and said, thank you for clarifying, much appreciated. And we did have 2 more questions come up on weighted scoring.
Cool.
So we have a question from Denise, who asked about the pink column, the criteria column,
Yep.
asking about why those are considered assumptions. And she said, shouldn't we strive to make sure the pink items are not assumptions? Instead, they should be based on goals, priorities tied to corporate strategic goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And these should be based. The thing is that everything is an assumption. Every time you're basically putting something forward saying, I think it's most important for a company to go aim for this, this, and this. Everything that you say within a company is an assumption you're making until you've checked and done some work around it and sort of minimized any of the work that you've done on those assumptions. You never have perfect information. You never 100% know what the perfect criteria are for your company to go work at. Each company has a different sort of playbook that they could be aiming for. And so that's what I meant by it's an assumption, right? Like you could go into a company and say, well, actually, I think our strategy could change a little bit. And so if you change that strategy, then you're actually going after slightly different criteria. Does it mean that the first criteria you were going at were in fact the wrong ones? Or is it just a different set because you sort of changed your lens or changed your information or changed something else? And so, you know, different companies, if you had team A in one company, they might come up with one set of criteria for the team. Team B for that same company might come up with a different set of criteria. They'd almost certainly come up with different weighting for it and different scoring for it. And so, you know, at the end of the day, the everything within this chart is sort of based on the humans who are making these guesses on what they think is best for the company based on the information around them.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for clarifying that definition of assumption.
Yeah, and every assumption can be checked, and you shouldn't tie yourself in circles trying to check every assumption, but assume everything is an assumption and try not to multiply assumptions together to make them worse.
Definitely. Great. So the last question we have here comes from Brat, and he asks, have you also come across the weighted shorted job first prioritization framework? And if you have, what are your thoughts on it?
The weighted prioritization framework?
Shorted job first prioritization framework.
Weighted? You'll have to say that one more time.
Weighted shorted job first framework.
Weighted shorted job first framework. No, I've never heard that string of words.
It's like shortest job first prioritization.
Oh, weighted shortest job first. No, I haven't come across that one. If I were to try to understand that based on the phrasing of it, I guess it's sort of assuming that you go after the shortest job first, based on, go for something that's a combination of a good score plus the shortest job, maybe, and therefore you're sort of picking your quick wins. I'm not entirely sure. So no, I haven't come across that one. It sort of sounds like almost like a combination of different things that people have tried. And yes, there are definitely mashups of different scoring, different prioritization frameworks. I sort of tried to pick the top most popular 5 today, and did not have time to go into the rabbit holes. So that one sounds like an interesting one that I want to look up later. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Well, those are all the questions we have for this section. So why don't we...
Cool. All right. So RICE is sort of like a fancy weighted scoring prioritization framework. I think it was devised by Intercom. I'm not entirely sure on that, but I'm pretty sure they were the source. They've definitely popularized it. And theirs is sort of a way of scoring things based on their criteria are based on impact and reach. So that's what's sort of giving it the weight. Reach being how many people or interactions has this actually impacted? What sort of impact, as in how useful is this? What sort of impact has it had on that particular user or that particular transaction? And effort, we talked about earlier, so you sort of divide it by that. But they add another interesting one, which is confidence. And what they've done is basically said, if any of these scores you're not particularly confident in, give it a score out of 100. If you're 100% confident that you've got your reach and impact scores, and they are tied down, you're not making big assumptions on them, then give it a high confidence score. If you don't have huge confidence in these, then give it a low confidence score and use that as a multiplier to bring up or down the score. Some people like this one, some people don't. I find that reach and impact sort of have a similar take on each other, right? Like, what's the difference between the two at the end of the day? The confidence score, I'm not sure if it sits in the right place or not. So there's mixed reactions to this one. It has its benefits, it has its drawbacks, but it is a one way of sort of looking at things. I think where the problem comes in again is that it's not getting the information of reach, impact, confidence, and effort. These are all good pieces of information to have, just like these are all good pieces of information to have. It's when you try to boil it down to a single number and make a decision based on that one number, because you're multiplying your assumptions against each other, that the problem comes in. So the RICE score has its own problems, but definitely using this as ways to ask the right questions is useful. And story mapping is a completely different take on a prioritization framework, and it gets a good mention because I bet that a lot of people are using this alongside other prioritization frameworks and not even thinking about it as a framework. The way that I think about it is story mapping is essentially taking a journey, a particular journey. Maybe somebody wants to go buy something, right? And so you map that out using cards at the top. So finding the product, looking at the details, putting in the cart and buying it. And you put those along the top, and then you itemize the different sort of tasks, the different things that the user might do along the way underneath each of those things. You put the most important tasks, the key tasks, along the top, and then you draw a line and you say, okay, so the things that fit above that line are the stuff that's going to go in MVP or V1 or V2 or V3 or whatever else. And that helps you visualize what sort of stories are going to be included in each version. This one is really nice and user-centered. Definitely has that visual element. Definitely does help you understand that customer journey and see holes in the customer journey where you might be letting them down. See opportunities like that. It helps you define iterations in your product, which it's useful for. It's not very good for outlining revenue opportunities or things like that, spotting things that might be more business-centric or technical-centric rather than just user-centric. And it is very good at leading to scope creep, because it's very easy for people to say, oh, well, MVP, let's make it, this, and draw a bigger line underneath. My actual personal preference is actually a combination of impact and effort, which you can do in ProdPad already, and variations on story mapping, which is actually just a really nice way to visualize what your users are trying to achieve with your product. So I think it's a nice way to sort of pick and choose which of these work best for your own sort of purposes. And the key here is that no framework is perfect, but as frameworks are simply ways to frame your thinking, most frameworks can be useful in some way. The key is to pick and mix the best set for your job. An experienced product person knows when to use one, like when they're trying to get a consistent set of data to measure a set of potential features in their backlog, and when to step away from them, like when their gut instinct tells them that the algorithm or the framework or the weighted scoring isn't accounting for all the information at hand. So just like I was talking about using a combination of impact and effort and user story mapping, both are helping me understand different pieces of the data. Somebody with that question around I'm going to get this wrong, the weighted shortest job method. That sounds like a mashup of two different things. There's tons of different subsets and different types of prioritization techniques that you can make use of. So figure out which sort of set that you want to pull from your back pocket for any sort of use and use them to and figure out which one works for you. Now, the best part of being a product person is that you're human, and as a human, you're naturally adaptable in this way to pick and choose, and you're naturally curious as well. So if you're looking to learn about new frameworks, then you might want to put that new framework to the test, or you might be asking yourself whether your existing framework is actually working or not. Is it helping or hindering? So let's look at how you actually check a framework. So what I recommend you do for this is to try a framework alongside your usual prioritization process, maybe for a week or two or something like that. And as you were doing that, start sense checking its results, right? Is the weighted scoring method, or is the impact and effort, or is whatever else, does it seem right? Is it coming up with results that are similar to what your previous method was coming up with? Does it feel good against your gut? Now, the thing is that you won't know by yourself. It's not your job to have all this stuff. It's actually your job as the product manager to check those assumptions. And you won't be able to do that just by sense checking only your gut. One of the keys with assessing a framework isn't just about looking at what the final results was. It's not that it was perfect at predicting the right things to work on in the right order, but also did it get you to ask the right sorts of questions? Did it help you in surfacing assumptions faster, rallying people around stuff and understanding different criteria and different potential barriers and other things you might want to know faster than you otherwise would have? And there's one framework that I didn't talk about, as I wouldn't call it a framework per se, but a method of working that I'm sure almost all product people are aware of, which is road mapping. the act of product road mapping is a prioritization tactic, and it's a really powerful one because if done right, it takes the focus off prioritizing feature X versus feature Y and getting lost in a deep, dark backlog, and instead focuses your attention on the company level objectives and the problems to be solved, right? So somebody asked a really good question about those criteria being assumptions. Product road mapping is checking those, is there to help you check those top level criteria, check that you're actually solving the right sorts of big problems, rather than focusing on whether feature X or feature Y needs to go first. That doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It's are you going after this market or whatever else is happening. So here's an example of a roadmap where each of the white cards here represents initiatives or problems to be solved. And the further out they are, the less defined they are. Each card is linked to one or two objectives. So is it going to get you revenue or user growth or engagement or market share? These are sort of those criteria that we were talking about, those company level goals or objectives. Each card then has its own subset of priorities of features or ideas, or what I actually like to think of as experiments to be run in order to solve the problem. And it even uses an impact and effort measurement to show us whether it's a quick win or a time sink or a big project or something in between, making it easier to understand at a glance. And the key is that the roadmap isn't this perfect plan that's meant to be set in stone. It's meant to be flexible and it's meant to change. All it's actually doing is laying out the assumptions the product team is making on a bigger scale that allows them to check whether those assumptions are valid or not and validate or invalidate them. And in that way, I'd actually consider the product roadmap to be more of a prototype for your strategy. What I mean by that is, like, if you were building a product feature, you wouldn't start off with a fully high-def version of the page and send that straight on to development. You'd start off with a little scrap of paper. You'd sketch out what you think it's supposed to look like. You take that piece of paper to a customer or somebody on your team, and they'd give you feedback on it. You probably wouldn't be right the first time, and you'd probably throw out that piece of paper and start again based on the feedback that you heard. And that piece of paper would get thrown out time and time again. Those prototypes get tossed. And the value isn't in the prototype, that piece of paper. It's in the process of prototyping. It's in the values in that conversation that you're having around the questions, the assumptions that you're making as you're putting them down on paper. And in the same way, your roadmap isn't valuable in itself. The roadmap's going to get tossed. The whole point of the roadmap is to lay out the big assumptions that you're making, the big problems you want to solve, so you can put them in front of somebody and say, hey, based on everything I know, I think we need to solve this problem, then this problem, then this problem. Is that about right? And if not, then do we need to add in something to account for this problem, and where do they sit in that roadmap? And soon enough, as you start doing so, you'll start getting people sense checking that, and you'll start making sure that the top line criteria assumptions are checked, that your top line problems, problems to be solved are in fact the right things. And that actually helps drive your product strategy and your prioritization much more powerfully than getting stuck in the details of digging through a huge backlog and figuring out which things need to go first or whatever else. Which takes me to another sort of trap that I see, which is that a lot of people get stuck in what we call this sort of over-prioritization trap. And what I mean by that is, like, it doesn't actually really matter what's below the line. And I'm not sure if many of you work in sort of a typical agile thing, but I know that in a lot of environments, you'll have sort of like what you call the work that's above the line, which is ready for developers to pick up and work on. That's sort of like your dev backlog. And then you've got everything below the line, like your product backlog, all the stuff that's not ready to be built yet. And I find that a lot of people will spend a lot of time trying to prioritize everything in their backlog, all 500 tickets, and trying to figure out everything that's going everywhere. Reality is that if you're trying to work out what goes next into development, you really only need to figure out what's happening in the next sprint. And enough work to keep the developers busy for that, and figure out what the next big problems are for the company to tackle. and the next problems after that, you need to check your assumptions on. But it doesn't really matter what's below that line, because by the time that sprint is out, you now have the chance to go back, check what was actually working or not, and go reprioritize. You're constantly going to be prioritizing. So you can come up with whatever sort of method of calculating and figuring out and prioritizing and coming up with a score for everything in your backlog and understanding everything that's in there, and saying, well, here's the list of everything we're ever going to do, and that's all going to get blown out of the water if you build something and learn something along the way. So the whole point is that don't over prioritize, don't try to build something and then make promises of everything you think that's going to be built beyond there. Focus on making sure you prioritize just enough for the developers to keep busy for the next little while, and then stop and learn from it and use those learnings to help you figure out what goes into the next things to prioritize. So frameworks are useful, but they aren't silver bullets. So don't let that framework drive you. Use the frameworks to help augment your decision making. I did a webinar this time last week, and we're talking about AI and whether product managers are going to be replaced by AI anytime soon, and the answer is no. We still need humans. We still need human factors. There's no algorithm, there's no framework, there's no scoring, there's nothing like that. Prioritization is a human factor, and prioritization is what product people do at our very core, because we need to be adaptable. We need to adapt and change based on what we're learning every day. So there is no silver bullet, but there is a lot that we can learn by knowing different frameworks. So in conclusion, focus on your one priority where possible, not all the priorities. Focus on what's above that line and keeping just enough people busy, not everything. Explore common frameworks like impact versus effort, RICE, story mapping, and whatever else catches the world's fancy, but don't let them drive you. Don't get too caught up in it. Use road mapping as a way to understand your priorities and get team buy-in. Make sure that everyone understands what the core problems are. And that is how you can find a product prioritization framework that hopefully works for you. So thanks very much. As I said, I know you probably have questions, so feel free to, if we don't get a chance to chat today, connect with me on LinkedIn, find me on Twitter as Simply Bastow, drop me an email. If we're ever in the same city, I'm actually based in Brighton, UK, so come by. It's sunny and dry, I promise. We can always go for a coffee or a beer and chat. And in the meantime, I welcome your questions today.
Yes, thank you so much, Janna. This has been a fantastic presentation. And before we dive into any of the questions, I just want to remind our audience that the recording and slides for this session will be emailed to you within 48 hours of the webinar. So if you have to drop off now, or if you missed anything that we talked about, don't worry, you'll be able to catch that in the slides and recording. And we're also going to be sending out a feedback survey when you log off. So please help us to make our webinars better and tell us what you thought of today. All right, so the first question that we have comes from Derek, and this is referring to the RICE framework that we talked about. And he says that it seems like the reach and impact would just be co-correlated and overemphasize the same point. Is that true?
I don't disagree. There are differences in it if you read up the original thing. So reach is meant to be how many people it's reaching, and impact is meant to be like how deep that impact is. So if it's meant to reach a lot of people but not really make a difference to them, so that's sort of like a thin sort of score there. If it's meant to reach only like some people but make a huge impact on them, then you're sort of getting like a score like that. So that's sort of what it's trying to do there. But I agree that sort of like giving you the same, you could just sort of say like impact is like this, and that sort of gives you the same sort of information. So it's giving you two scores for what I would call impact rather than one score. At the end of the day, they're both still just assumptions you're making. So you're taking that score and broken it up into two numbers and then multiplying them together to make one number. I mean, take that information as you will, and when you're using that calculation, keep that in mind so that you don't get tripped up and end up misusing that information or getting led astray by it.
Awesome, thank you. And we have another question from Joseph. You provided a lot of detail here, so thank you, Joseph. He asked if there's a standard intake that you have seen that the business can use to submit requests to the product owner to begin the prioritization effort. And then in other words, is there an easy and efficient way to streamline what is being asked by the business that contains enough background or data for the product owner and other stakeholders to begin to have a conversation about priorities for a Scrum team to work on?
Yeah, I mean, you can always try ProdPad for that. One of the reasons I ended up building it was because I had this sort of onslaught of ideas, but didn't have enough places to, didn't have enough information to actually do anything with it. Now, one of the problems that I have is that if you end up creating a form with like intake information and saying, here's like, even if you made it into a really nice form, like a beautiful typed form or Google form or something really lovely and usable, if you asked a whole bunch of questions in there saying, hey, we've got this idea, can you give us all this information on it? The more fields you put in there, the less likely somebody's going to give you that information. And each time somebody decides not to give you that information, that's a black hole of information. You're just missing that info. So I think it's actually on the product manager to make it easier for their teammates to actually pull that information in, which is why we made it in ProdPad easier to submit ideas and feedback and insights that people have, and then creates a space for the product manager to go, okay, so here's something that doesn't have a lot of info. Let's go back and ask this person for this piece and this person for this piece and this person for this piece. And that sort of builds it out into something that's more useful, as opposed to trying to gather everything all up front. In early tests, when we had an all up front thing, we realized that it was hit or miss. Some people would just ignore it. Some people would fill it out if they really cared, but more often than not, you sort of miss that information and it wouldn't really work. So try not to get stuck in the whole full intake upfront thing, because frankly speaking, people kind of suck at giving that information up front, and you're more likely to get it if you tease it out of them in small pieces, digestible pieces over time.
Perfect. Thank you. I think that's a really comprehensive and great answer. So thank you so much. We have another question from Luis, who asks about short-term prioritization. So like keeping the devs busy for the next sprint. He says, it doesn't help you with long-term planning such as staffing. So he's curious how you would recommend creating yearly hiring plans with the Agile approach.
Yearly hiring plans with the Agile approach. To be honest, I'm not sure the two really do jive all that well. Yearly hiring plans are always going to be difficult to figure out because the Agile approach basically says that you're going to build something, you're going to check whether what you built was actually useful or not, and then you're going to iterate upon that. A yearly hiring thing is basically saying, well, how many people are we going to need by December? And the thing with hiring is that it takes months and months and months to get each person. And once you hire somebody, sometimes they take a couple months to actually quit their job and get started with you. So you simply can't do Agile planning and resource planning in an Agile way, knowing who's going to be starting when and how that's going to affect like your capacity and that sort of stuff. So sort of don't try. You can have sort of rough estimates on that, and you can sort of give like okay, so we're hoping to have somebody in by June, and we're hoping the team's going to look like this, but adjust it as you learn more about it. I'm not sure I have an answer for you. I don't think any team has a strict answer to that one. But what you should be doing is when you are a product manager and you're prioritizing for what needs to happen next, you're prioritizing for the next 2 to 4 weeks worth, the next 1 to 2 sprints ahead or so, at which point you should have pretty reasonable ideas to who's going to be working or not. You have a pretty good idea as to how big your team is going to be, plus or minus 1 to 5 if there's like some sickness or holidays or something goes wrong, because it always goes wrong. And therefore, your job as a product manager is to put a set number of things forward, saying, here's what I think the next 20 candidates are. You as the dev team go work out how you're going to go build this, and hopefully we get X number of things back out the other end. But if you happen to be 5 tickets short, or you end up having room for several more things, then you have to be ready to either accept that or find new things to prioritize quickly to get into that to fill that. More often than not, you're going to find that things end up going slower than expected, so you end up saying, well, actually the sprint ended up not filling everything we wanted it to. So putting it this way, you can't even know how many people are going to be working during any one sprint because you don't know who's going to be sick or not. There's no way you're going to be able to know who's going to be working 10 sprints from now. You don't know who's going to be leaving or coming or going or whatever else.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that's a tough question, so thank you for trying to fit all of the different answers that could possibly apply into that concise response. And actually, while we're on the topic of sprints, we have another question from Srikanth, who asks, any thoughts on product backlog refinement and when it should be considered for sprints?
Yeah, so product backlog refinement and it being considered for sprints. The way that I see the product manager playing in with sprints is that sprint or development teams want to be autonomous. They want to be given the chance to work at their own pace, and they want to be given the chance to work on things. They want to be given problems and not solutions, and they want to be given the time to work on those solutions in the way that makes sense for them. And they don't want to be fed a strict plan saying, in this sprint, you have to do this, 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 and this. What's actually best is to actually give them a variety of different things they could go work on, and they can then work with their lead dev or scrum master or as a team to look at the list of things that you've prioritized. Maybe you've prioritized 50 next things that are important to the business, and they can choose out of that 50 next things and go, okay, so we think this set here and this set here and this set here are all important, and they all make sense to work on at the same time. So while we're in there, let's take those things and put them all into one thing. And they may not come out in the same order that you're putting them in, right? So I always tell product managers to sort of let go of your final prioritization when it goes into development. So you might say, to me, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to go into this order, but by the time it comes into development, it comes out backwards because they've worked on it in a slightly different way. Because building tech is more of an art than a science. It might make sense to say, well, actually, let's put that one off in the other sprint because we actually had to do this one instead, and something else happened, right? So let go of the fine-grained prioritization and trust that as long as you're putting like the top 20 or top 50, depending on how many developers you have and how many sprints you have going on at one time, the top set of things to go work on, trust that your developers are going to be working on those things, and it's going to come out like this sprint or probably the next sprint, more or less. And that gives them the autonomy to go work on the right things at the right time according to them, and they can then splice in whatever bugs and other DevOps tasks that they need to keep down tech debt and keep the systems running properly and everything else, and feel like they're doing a good job as well. Your job then is actually a lot easier. You just figure out, like, more or less what are the next few things to go in. If they've cleared out 20 things in their last sprint, go put 20 more things in there, but flag up the things from the last one saying these are still pretty important, so make sure to try to prioritize those for the next sprint. And that should give you the best of both worlds for both the product managers and the developers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that response. I especially liked your point on how building tech is often more of an art than a science. I think that that's a really beautiful way of framing.
Yeah, and it is important to think of your developers more of artists than they are. They're not manufacturing lines. They're not there to just go do your tickets, your stories. They're there to, as much as you, help find the best way of building this product. So treat them like the adaptable humans that they are.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really important point. All right, so we have time for one final question. We have a question from David who asks, how does a good prioritization framework or good prioritization practices help to resist an organization's inclination towards losing strategic focus and chasing after today's shining object, which is often brought forward by some influential stakeholder?
Mm-hmm. Road mapping, better road mapping practices will help with that. I find sometimes that a prioritization framework, if you're talking about prioritizing just the backlog, people do tend to get, like, honestly, like fights about why this thing deserves to be over this thing, deserves to be over this thing. And the reason they're fighting is because at that point in time, you just got a whole bunch of opinions about why this isn't more important than this and that sort of thing. When in reality, if you're thinking about things in terms of the roadmap, and your roadmap is objective and outcome focused, and you're thinking about the problems that you're looking to solve on that roadmap and the order that you're solving those problems, everything else comes from there, right? And that way, when you're saying, okay, well, if our main objective is to increase user growth and then it's to get revenue, then why are we focusing on this? Why is this the most important thing? Obviously, this is the right idea. So let's put that on top and put that on the roadmap alongside this particular project, this particular initiative, this particular problem that we've outlined. And by doing so, it takes away a lot of the questions, a lot of the debates, and focuses everyone on the problems that the company is in fact trying to solve.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of great insight in that response, and I think that that should be helpful for a lot of the audience, not just the person who asked this question, because I know that that comes up in many an organization.
Great, I hope so.
Yeah, definitely. And if you have any lingering questions that we haven't gotten to, or you just didn't have time to write it in, feel free to send it to us afterwards, and we'll be sure to pass them along to Jenna, who I know is going to be very happy to respond to them. And that's all the time that we have for today. So I hope all of you had half as much fun as I did. This has been a really insightful and great presentation. Thank you so much for being here with us, Janna. If anybody is interested in learning more about Janna or ProdPad, please look at all of the contact information that's listed on the screen. And you can find Product Management Today at the contact information that's listed on the other half of the screen.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. And if anybody missed anything, don't worry, the recording and slides will be emailed to you. So have a great day, everyone.
Bye.